Napoleon's Russian disaster, 1812. By 1812, Napoleon controlled almost all of continental Europe. France was at its peak. His military reputation was untouchable. But one thing bothered him: Russia. Tsar Alexander had been drifting away from France's political orbit. Trade agreements were breaking down. Napoleon decided the only solution was to force Russia back into line by marching an army of over 600,000 soldiers directly into Russian territory. It was the largest army ever assembled in European history at that point, and Napoleon expected a quick victory. What he got instead was silence. The Russians didn't fight head-on. They retreated. They burned their own villages. They destroyed their own food supplies. They left Napoleon's massive army marching through empty, scorched land with nothing to eat and no one to fight. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, the city was mostly abandoned and then set on fire by the Russians themselves. Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for weeks, expecting the Tsar to negotiate. The Tsar never came. Winter arrived early, and it was brutal. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze in their uniforms. Horses died by the thousands. Disease tore through the camps. The army that had marched in with 600,000 men staggered back with fewer than 100,000. Napoleon's image of invincibility was gone. Within 2 years, he was forced to abdicate the French throne. Within 3 years, it was completely over. The mistake wasn't just that he invaded Russia. The mistake was that he underestimated the cost of fighting a war on someone else's terms, in someone else's land, against an enemy willing to sacrifice everything. He had won every battle before by controlling the conditions. In Russia, he couldn't control anything. Hitler's second Russian mistake, 1941. History repeated itself just over a century later, and almost identically. Adolf Hitler had by 1941 occupied most of Western Europe. Britain was isolated, France had fallen, and just like Napoleon, Hitler turned his eyes east toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. In the early months, Germany made stunning progress. Soviet forces were overwhelmed. Entire armies were encircled and captured. It looked like the war in the East would be over by autumn. Then the same thing happened. The distances were too vast. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. German trucks broke down on roads that turned to mud when the autumn rains came. The mud was so thick it swallowed vehicles whole. Then winter arrived, and German soldiers equipped for a short summer campaign found themselves fighting at -40 degrees in summer uniforms. Hitler had been warned. His own generals told him the timeline was too aggressive. They told him the Soviet Union was not France. It was not Poland. It was a country that had survived invasion after invasion for centuries. Hitler dismissed every warning. The Soviet Union held. Then it pushed back. And by 1945, Soviet soldiers were raising their flag over the ruins of Berlin. 2 leaders, same country, same mistake, same outcome, a century apart. Tsar Nicholas II and the Fall of the Romanovs, 1905 to 1917. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia inherited one of the largest empires on earth. He had total power. He had loyal armies. He had enormous resources. What he lacked was the ability to read the room. In January 1905, thousands of Russian workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They were not violent. They carried religious icons and portraits of the Tsar himself. They wanted to present a petition asking for better working conditions, shorter hours, and basic rights. Nicholas wasn't even in the palace that day, but the soldiers he left in charge opened fire on the crowd. Many people lost their lives. It became known as Bloody Sunday, and it permanently shattered the image of the Tsar as a protector of his people. Nicholas responded to the growing unrest by making small, reluctant concessions, never enough to satisfy the people, but always enough to make him look weak. He entered World War I, completely unprepared. He personally took command of his armies in 1915, which meant every military loss was now directly tied to his name. While soldiers suffered at the front, reports from the capital told of food shortages and rising anger among ordinary citizens. Nicholas continued to believe the situation was under control. He trusted the wrong advisors. He ignored the right ones. He believed the loyalty of the Russian people would hold no matter what. In March 1917, revolution broke out across the country. Nicholas stepped down from power. Within a year, he and his entire family were gone. The mistake wasn't a single order or decision. It was years of refusing to adapt, refusing to listen, and refusing to accept that the world around him had fundamentally changed. Lyndon B. Johnson and Vietnam, 1964 to 1968. On the other side of the world and several decades later, the same pattern appeared in a different form. Lyndon B. Johnson became President of the United States after John F. Kennedy in 1963. He inherited a growing military involvement in Vietnam. And step by step, decision by decision, he walked the United States deeper into a war it could not win the way it was being fought. The core mistake was not military. It was informational. Johnson and his advisors consistently received reports from military commanders in Vietnam saying the war was going well, enemy casualties were high, progress was being made, victory was close. Johnson believed these reports, or chose to believe them, even as evidence on the ground told a different story. In 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive. They simultaneously attacked over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It was so massive that it shocked the American public. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was repelled, but politically, it was devastating. Americans watching the news saw that after years of being told the war was nearly won, the enemy was capable of striking everywhere at once. Trust in the government collapsed. Johnson's approval ratings fell off a cliff. He announced he would not seek re-election. The U.S. spent another 7 years in Vietnam, eventually withdrawing in 1975, with no victory achieved. The mistake: building strategy around optimistic reports instead of honest ones. King George III and the American colonies, 1770s. Not all mistakes are made from arrogance. Some are made from stubbornness. By the 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was visibly breaking down. The colonies were generating enormous wealth for Britain, but they had no representation in the British Parliament. New taxes were being imposed without any input from the colonists. Tensions were rising every year. Multiple voices inside and outside the British government warned King George III and his ministers that the policy toward the colonies was unsustainable. Edmund Burke, one of the most respected political thinkers of the era, gave speeches in Parliament arguing that Britain needed to treat the colonies with more flexibility and respect. Benjamin Franklin himself traveled to London and spent years trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. George III refused to budge. The taxes stayed, the troops stayed, the attitude stayed. When fighting broke out in 1775, it was still not too late. There were moments, multiple moments, where a compromise could have been reached. George III rejected every serious attempt at negotiation. By 1783, Britain formally recognized American independence. 13 colonies, which had been a major source of British wealth and power, were gone permanently. A new nation existed on the other side of the Atlantic, one that would eventually become the most powerful country on Earth. That rigidity cost Britain an empire. Mikhail Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union, 1985 to 1991. This one is different because the leader's mistake wasn't cruelty or aggression. It was misjudging what his reforms would unleash. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. The economy was stagnating. The government was corrupt and inefficient. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and morale. Something had to change. Gorbachev introduced two major policies: glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring. The idea was to modernize the Soviet system to allow more freedom of speech, reduce corruption, and reform the economy while keeping the Communist Party in control. It was a reasonable idea, but Gorbachev severely underestimated the pressure that had been building beneath the surface for decades. Once the lid was loosened, everything came pouring out. Suppressed national identities in Soviet republics began pushing for independence. Citizens who had never been allowed to criticize the government suddenly had a voice, and they used it loudly. Economic reforms disrupted what little stability existed without replacing it with anything better. Gorbachev tried to manage the process, but it moved faster than any management was possible. By December 1991, the Soviet Union, one of the two superpowers that had defined global politics for nearly half a century, had officially ceased to exist. 15 new countries emerged from its collapse. The Cold War ended. the entire global order shifted. Gorbachev's mistake was not his intention. His intentions were arguably good. His mistake was assuming he could control the speed and direction of change in a system that had been under enormous pressure for generations. He opened a door without understanding what was standing on the other side. Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962. By the late 1950s, Mao Zedong had already transformed China. He had united the country, driven out foreign powers, and built a government from the ground up. His authority was absolute. His followers were devoted, and he was completely convinced that China could become an industrial superpower, not in decades, but in years. In 1958, Mao launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. The plan was simple on paper. Farmers would stop focusing only on crops. Villages would set up small furnaces and produce steel. Industry and agriculture would grow together, side by side, at a speed the world had never seen. Nobody told him it wasn't working. Not because they didn't know, they knew. Local officials across the country could see that the steel being produced in backyard furnaces was low quality and useless. They could see that farmers pulled away from their fields meant crops were rotting unharvested. They could see that food production was collapsing. But Mao had made his position clear. Those who questioned the plan were labeled as enemies of progress. So instead of reporting the truth, local officials reported what Mao wanted to hear. Numbers were inflated. Harvests were exaggerated. On paper, China was thriving. On the ground, people were going hungry. By the time the reality became impossible to hide, it was too late. One of the worst famines in recorded history had taken hold across the country. Tens of millions of people lost their lives over 4 years, not because of a natural disaster, not because of an outside enemy, but because a leader demanded loyalty over honesty, and an entire system chose to protect itself instead of telling the truth. Mao eventually acknowledged the policy had failed and stepped back from some of his economic roles, but he never fully accepted the scale of what had happened. He remained in power until his passing in 1976. If you found this interesting, subscribe and drop a comment below. Tell us what you want to see covered next.